Thank you everybody for joining this afternoon for my talk on breeding waders. Hopefully I'll give you some more information about the status of breeding waders in the national park, the sort of habitats that they require for nesting and breeding, some of the issues that they face, and outline some of the conservation work that's being done by the Yorkshire Dales National Park Authority and a wide range of other organisations. So during my presentation, we'll talk about why waders are important, go through the key species, focus on the population declines, and hopefully finish on some of the positive work that's being undertaken to protect these species. Just very briefly, as an introduction, and while I've got a captive audience, just to remind some people who may not be aware of the sort of the issues with the national parks. So we are 15 members of the national park family, as you can see on this map, from the Cairngorms in Scotland right down to Dartmoor, New Forest and the South Downs on the south coast. We're all DEFRA bodies, so we are funded from government, but we rely on a lot of external funding sources as, like many public sector bodies, finances are tight at the moment, but we do get a core grant from government that is supplemented by external funding. National parks are all designated really to protect the areas of both upland and lowland landscapes because of their wildlife, the beautiful countryside and cultural heritage. So these are some of the most important areas in the country for these particular categorisations. I think a couple of points that would be great if people take away from this about national parks is that these are living landscapes. So the national park authorities don't own the land. Some authorities own more land than others. For example, the Lake District do own quite a bit of land, but on the whole, all these are in private ownership. They are living and working areas for farmers, land managers. And there's a lot of villages and towns within those, and our role is to try and work with these local communities to protect them. For in this case, on my talk today, about breeding waders. Another key thing to remember is that one of our statutory purposes is to try and encourage people to come and enjoy the qualities of the national park, learn about the wildlife, learn about the landscapes. So we have this sort of remit where we do want to encourage people to come in, but also we have to manage them and help manage them so they don't have a negative impact on the landscape or the wildlife. So a lot of our work is involved in this. And like I say, one of the key things is that we don't actually own the land. So our work is advisory, working with lots of landowners and land managers. So for those of you who aren't aware, this is the area of the national park stretching from sort of Skipton down in the south up sort of Kirby Stephen, up towards Appleby in the north. The slightly paler areas were the boundary extension that happened recently, where the area of the national park was increased by 24%, which unfortunately had a complementary increase in our finances. So we are left with, managing a larger area of the park before. But hopefully this gives you an idea of the sort of area that we covered. So, like you say, you can see the areas we're talking about during the presentation today. Just very briefly about the land management section, which I work in, and to try and give you a flavour very briefly of the work that we do. So within this section, there is the farm conservation team who deal with the landowners, land managers. One of the main drivers or the main funding sources for our landscape conservation is through the agri-environment schemes that some of you may have heard of. These are the grant schemes that are paid by government to landowners for managing their land in an environmentally friendly way and for the benefit of wildlife. So they sort of make up the gap between, or hopefully make up the gap between what the payments would be if you were farming an area intensively and if you were doing it for nature conservation. So a very simple example really is one, for example, hay meadows, that if you were from a farming perspective, what you really want to do is maximise the area of grass and the amount of grass that you take off for feeding your stock over winter. So you might want to take 2 or 3 cuts, possibly take a silage cut to make sure you did maximise this. But from a wildlife point of view, we really want to see those flowers those meadows with lots of flowers in that all set seed, all the grasses and plants, put the seed down for the next generation and for birds to feed on. And any birds such as the breeding waders that are nesting in there to actually get their young off and fledge. So what these schemes do, or some of the schemes can do, they can offer a grant payment to the farmer so that they are compensated for not taking an early cut and cutting late, so that, like I say, the plant and the bird species can thrive. So that is a very simplistic introduction to the agri-environment scheme process. I'm sure you can imagine that it is a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of paperwork to fill in, a lot of work to be done. So our farm conservation team will help the landowners get into these schemes and help them with the paperwork so that we can get land managed to manage for national park purposes. Very similarly, we have the trees and woodland section that deal with, as the name suggests, the trees and woodlands grants. So, they play a similar role in encouraging landowners to plant woodland, helping providing advice on specifications, and also through the grant applications. And then we have the wildlife conservation team, where I'm based. So we, generally speaking, simplistically again, we look at trying to work out, along with other organisations and partners, where the priority habitats and priority species are within the national park. So then when we can work with our colleagues in the other two teams, if a landowner comes forward, for example, to come into agri-environment schemes and we know that they have breeding waders or a priority hay meadow, we can then look at targeting the prescriptions and the management to protect those species. So we work very closely together in trying to deliver, like I say, the land so it's managed to meet national park purposes. I stress a lot of the land is most of the land in the Yorkshire Dales is in private ownership, so we are playing an advisory role, so we have to work with land managers. We want to work with them in an amicable way, and we have to try and, like I say, persuade them and cajole them and look to working with them so they can deliver from a land management perspective that meets their needs and also for a wildlife perspective. So that's very brief introduction into my sort of work within the park and our section. So we now move on to talk about the waders and just why are waders important. Well, there's a lot of different reasons, a lot of different people have different ideas, but when you look at the sort of folklore and cultural heritage, breeding waders do feature very heavily in a lot of this, like I say, folklore going back. Just picked out a few examples really to give you like I say, a few examples. So some of it goes back, really long time, as you can see here, back to the 16th century, where curlew and other waders were actually had an ominous warning, really, and thought to foretell death, which is perhaps not the best sort of introduction for waders, but there were a lot of, like I said, different cultural links in different areas of the country to these species. Perhaps a more beneficial one is the folklore from Wales, which probably explains, or they look to explain, why the curlew nests are so hidden and well hidden in the grass. And obviously you can see from that that there is again folklore in there. And perhaps one of the more widespread ones that you often see in a lot of different areas, irrespective of where they are in the country, is that, especially for curlews, that where they breed, that the waders coming back. We're at the time now where we're seeing the first breeding waders come back into the Dales, and they always, from a local perspective, always herald the start of spring, and so hopefully foretell a hopeful, positive sign that the winter's over and that spring and summer is coming. So there's a lot of folklore and heritage involved in a lot of these breeding waders across the country. This map really shows, hopefully you can see the arrows here that signify the population trends. So this is curlew, which a lot of the focus of my talk tonight will be on curlew. They are one of the key species, and a lot of the work is being done on. But these real declines really are applicable, unfortunately, to most of the species. So looking across Europe, you can see these arrows. Basically, the larger, the thicker the arrow, the bigger the population decline. So from this, you can see that curlew are declining right across their range, across Northern Europe, and in the UK as well, which, as you can see, holds anywhere between 20 and 30% of the global population. So the UK is vitally important for curlew and other waders that I'll talk about tonight. So like you can see from this, they do hold a high proportion of the populations. So we have a key role in trying to protect them and trying to manage for them to conserve these. And I think curlew, you're probably all aware of that, hence the popularity of the talk today. So curlew is perhaps one of the most pressing conservation priorities in the UK, which is why there are an awful lot of organisations working towards delivering positive management for curlew. Just to give you a feel for some of the sort of work that's been done in the park and why the national park is so important for breeding waders. So in the early 1990s, there was a moorland bird survey undertaken, which was basically all the land above the fell wall, so all the high ground, the heather moorland, and we managed to survey about 80% of that upland area within the national park. And these are the population figures that were derived from then. So you can see from these that there are really good numbers of a wide range of different breeding species found across the national park on the high ground. We also, in collaboration with the Irish PB, carried out an enclosed grassland wader survey in 2000, and you can see here on the black squares were the 1K squares that were surveyed. So this looked at the breeding waders, as the name suggests, in the enclosed ground. So this is the low ground below the fell wall. So this is all the important areas of moorland fringe, hare meadow and pasture were surveyed. And in total, we surveyed 88 different 1 kilometre squares. And these are the population totals that you can see from that. So it's not directly applicable to sort of just straightforwardly add these together because they were done at different times, and there will be some changes. But hopefully these two big surveys give you a feel for just how important areas of the national park are for these breeding wader species. So I'll just go through the key species that we talk about when we're talking about farmland waders. The really important ones are these species. So we have the lapwing. I'm sure you're all familiar with many of these species. Like I said earlier, they are currently moving back into the Dales, especially this warm or milder weather we've had at the start of the week. Seems to be, good numbers are coming back. So we do have, as you've seen from the figures, a good number of breeding lapwing. This is a species that you can sort of see from this photo do prefer the shorter areas of grassland. So these like to nest in areas where the land is quite heavily grazed. They don't like the tall vegetation much. So they do prefer areas where there is quite high sheep numbers. And one of the consequences of a lot of the work that's done, generally speaking, in terms of reducing stocking numbers, is that if you do lose the short grazed grassland, you will lose your lapwing populations. So it's not a straightforward process in many ways of managing them and just taking stock off, or this is one of the species that will actually suffer. So you can see these are the declines. There will be some additional data to add on to these, but this is basic from 1995 onwards. But you can see that there has been a big decline, albeit a slight increase in recent years, but numbers are definitely a lot lower than they were, like I say, at the beginning of the 1990s. And this is the abundance maps and distribution maps that were taken from the two national breeding atlases, which were done in the late 80s and early 90s, and again in late 2000 to 2011. So basically, when you're looking at these, the grey and the darker the grey squares are where the heaviest declines have been, and the areas where populations are increasing are in the red. So it's quite a good visual representation, this, to show how big the declines and how widespread the declines have been in many areas of the country, with very few areas showing increasing populations. So we have the curlew. Like I said, it's one of the most pressing needs for conservation in the UK. This is a species that prefers to nest in slightly more rushy areas where there's more cover. it is a bigger bird, so it does like that extra taller vegetation to nest in. So as you get areas that have got more rush ground, you will tend to get the curlews nesting in those. But they also will readily nest in the meadows, silage meadows and hay meadows that we have in the Dales, along with populations on the heather moorland. So you can see the very steep decline in the number of curlew, which is why it is, there are a lot of concerns and a lot of work being done nationally to protect this species. And again, similarly with the distribution maps and the change in the distribution, you can see there's been widespread declines in many areas. But you might just be able to make out, hopefully, some of those areas in red. There is that sort of line in the central Pennines, where the Yorkshire Dales lies, where populations are hopefully still doing relatively well, especially compared to other areas of the country. The snipe, another one of the classic species that we sort of talk about in terms of the upland farmland waders. A bit more of a cyclic population. Has gone under quite good increases in some years, but is quite cyclic and is more restricted in its distribution than some of the other species because it does prefer the very wet ground, and is at a very high risk if you start doing any drainage works to improve the land agriculturally. Snipe is often one of the first species that will go once you start drying that land out, which can be seen again from this the abundance maps, where that show that there have been these massive declines in many areas of the country. So if you look at this for all the species, it's generally the upland areas like the Yorkshire Dales National Park that are the key areas in the country now for most of our breeding waders, that outside, specially managed areas like nature reserves. And the other key one we'll think about is the redshank. This is a species that is often found on the lower ground, but will some of the higher altitude areas as well. Unlike the other waders, the redshanks tend to like areas where there is actually some open standing water, some small pools, some wet areas. So a bit like the snipe, this is one of the first species that goes if you actually start draining any land and start putting drains in to dry it out. And if those open areas of water go, you will often lose the redshank very quickly, along with the snipe. And as you can see, a bit repetitive this, but unfortunately, a lot of the population declines for all these species that we are concerned about all show a very similar trend like this. And again, as for the other species, a very similar decline in the areas of the country where numbers have been reduced, and very few areas where populations are increasing. So these are the key waders that we are talking about when we're talking, like I say, about these upland farmland waders. And as you can see from the last few slides, there is a lot of pressure on these birds because they're reducing both in the range across the country, and the number of birds in the relative areas are declining quite rapidly in many areas. But we are still fortunate that in the Yorkshire Dales we still have good populations of these, which is why we're trying to focus conservation efforts on trying to make sure that stays the case. So just really looking at what the sort of requirements are for waders and what they need. The key thing is they need to find at this time of year, like I said, they're moving back into the Dales. Most of the species will winter in lowland areas, coastal areas, partly because of the sort of traditional cold weather, snow, frozen ground, that they just basically couldn't feed in these areas in the winter. So they all move away and then return in the spring, with numbers, like I say, coming back now. So they're coming back to establish territories, and the key thing they need in these territories is a suitable area for nesting. One of the issues with breeding waders, especially birds like curlew, is they are very site fearful. So once they've nested somewhere, they will continue coming back to the same area to nest year after year, which can be a positive thing in terms of management. So if we can manage these areas where we know the nesting, hopefully we can manage that year on year. But one of the negatives is if there are changes in land management to a site where they, have nested the year before, if that land is a change of use. So if it changes from hay meadow to silage or woodland planting, very often these birds will come back and still attempt to nest, even though it becomes unsuitable. So there is positives and negatives of that sort of behaviour. Once they've got the territory, they need to, actually go get onto the business of nesting. So they need to find a suitable area in which to lay their eggs, where there's plenty of cover for the incubating female, and then she has to sit on the eggs, depending on the species, for 3 or 4 weeks. And often you get birds like this off-duty bird that will be keeping an eye on a nesting female and looking out for predators. So once they've hatched the eggs, most of the waders, or all of the waders, they will then move their chicks away from the actual nest. Some will move, relatively long distances into suitable areas to feed. So even species like lapwing, for example, that like to nest on the shorter grasser areas, as soon as they hatch the chicks, they'll look to move them into areas where there is some longer vegetation and wetter areas where they're a lot more suitable feeding habitats. And once they get to that, they need the chicks to another 3 to 5 weeks, again, depending on species. They need to look after and guard the chicks until hopefully they can get them off to fledging. Then once that's done as well, there is quite relatively, if they can get to the first autumn, then that's the real difficult period from the sort of, generally speaking, from the waders themselves to get through. And once the first year birds survive, you then need that adult and young bird survival. So they need areas outside of the nesting areas in winter and on passage where they can find suitable food and suitable habitat to survive. And basically, they just need to repeat that year on year. A lot of our waders are quite long-lived, so curlew will, easily make 11 years here, as you can see, often living up to 30 years. And lapwing as well can be quite long-lived. So they just need to get back and repeat that breeding success year after year. So like I say, with them coming back to the same areas, there is positives of that in terms of management, but also negatives. So I'll just go through some of the things that the waders need to do, some of the key habitats that we're trying to look to delivering through things like these agri-environment schemes that I mentioned earlier and other management work. So the vegetation height is crucial. So the different species all have slightly different habitat requirements in terms of the sort of sward height. So like I said, curlew will nest in some of the taller vegetation, like you can see here, where you've got patches of heather, patches of long grass, and also patches of rush that make ideal areas for concealing nests. The females in those can sort of hide away, but they also need this sort of open area for feeding. So as you can see on this slide in the background, the sort of brighter greener areas are areas of shorter vegetation. So they do need these areas to feed, where they can get access to get the probe the ground for the insects and the invertebrates alongside this area of habitat. So you do need to provide this mosaic of different habitats. As you can see in this slide here, you've got some of the taller rush and sort of clumps of grass, which are ideal for concealing nests. But also they need the open areas in which to feed and move the chicks about. And hopefully you can see the lapwing in the middle of the slide there, utilising this sward height. So they do need a varied structure. If you end up with all long grass, then there's nowhere for the chicks to feed. And if you end up with uniform short sward, then it's no good for a lot of the species. So managing that sward height, so you get this mosaic of vegetation heights, is one of the key things that we need to do. Cover of rush is also important. So they do like these areas of clumps of rush, like you can see here. Some of the species will nest in the smaller clumps. Snipe often like nesting in small clumps of rush. Just lifts the nest off the ground a bit in the wetter areas. But these also provide excellent places for shelter if you get heavy rain or bad weather, but also from protection from predators. So they do need some rush, and like you can see on this photograph, there's lots of areas where the adults and chicks can feed, but there is some sort of rush cover. If the rush gets too thick, as you can see on this, on the image on the right, on the left-hand side, that is rush that is just absolutely thick and solid, and possibly might be useful for nests, but it's very difficult for the adults and chicks to actually access. So one of the things we do advocate and work with landowners to do is rush cutting. So you can see here on the right, this is the area that's been cut that opens it up for the waders to feed in. And unsurprisingly, from breeding waders, they need wet features. So this is a classic area of wet ground. You can see there's areas of rush for the cover, but also the wet area where the adults can feed. And there's lots of insects in areas like this for the young chicks to feed on throughout the year. So these wet features need to remain in place and be present, throughout May and June during the chick rearing period, and not dry out too early in the season. And this is really the ideal habitat. If the farmers have got this on the land, then these are the sort of farms that hold the good numbers of breeding waders. Nice and wet in the middle, wet ground, mossy ground areas to feed, but also some not too much thick rush, but just enough rush to provide cover. They reckon that if you get above about 30% rush cover in a field, anything above that and it starts to decline for suitability for waders, anything above 50% and it's not really going to support many breeding waders at all. So where these features don't exist, we can, work with the landowners, encourage them through the grant system to actually provide habitats for waders. So things like scrapes and wet areas can be created if the ground conditions are right. A lot of the grant schemes actually have a requirement to cut rush. So here's one of the farmers. We had a demonstration day to show the sort of machinery that can be used. So if the rush is cut outside the breeding season, it will come back quite quickly and does need constant management. But as you can see as we're looking at it on the right-hand side of the tractor, there is thick areas of there that are just no good for breeding waders. So by opening it up and doing the rush cutting, we can improve the habitat that way. And also we can manage some of the features, so reprofiling ditches. Again, there's grant aid available for this. So this is a sort of scrape ditch that has been created to create those wet areas. But also one of the key features with some of the ditches is you do need a gently sloping sides so that any chick can actually get access to the wet areas, as you can see in this photograph. So sometimes if the ditches get too deep, they get too steep sided, they're not any good. And here you can see that the machinery is there to actually level out and flatten these, so they are a lot better for the breeding waders. So that's some of the habitat work we need to do and trying to get the habitat right and managed for these species. So why are they declining? One of the issues is that these are, as I said, they're often very long-lived birds and the adult survival is quite high. So, if they can actually survive their first autumn, winter and come back to breed, then the survival rates are very good. And these birds will long-lived, will potentially nest for a number of years. The big issue we've got with waders is the breeding success. So this will vary species on species. So I think these figures are for curlews. So basically, on average, a pair would need to fledge basically half a chick a year to actually maintain the population. So simplistically, that means that if every other year they get one chick off, they will maintain the population. But looking at some of the figures, some of the work that's been done by a range of organisations, that breeding success is a lot lower than it needs to be. So it is not maintaining populations. So this is why, as the adults die off, there just isn't the recruitment there of young birds to come through. And because of the long life of the birds, we are concerned that, if curlews are long-lived birds, and if you go out and survey them, you'll see them in the summer, they will be nesting. The population in terms of pairs will be stable, but they're just not getting any young off. So there'll become a point in time when these birds, die of old age, natural causes, and there just won't be the young birds there to actually come and replace them. So some of the issues that are driving that are changes in land management. One of the big issues has been the change from hay meadows to silage. So with silage meadows, these are cut a lot earlier. So especially on some of the intensive silage areas, you may well be getting the first cut of silage in mid-May, mid or late May, when the eggs are still in the nest, they haven't hatched. So if machinery goes over those, then they have no chance of survival. So it's the changes in farming practice that are driven by the sort of market or requirement for sort of lower food prices that are driving some of these land management changes. A lot of these are quite complex and quite, directly related, and it's not necessarily one specific issue. As hopefully this photograph shows, without that cover of rush, without areas for the adults to hide, you can imagine. Well, you can see from these photographs that when the adult's not incubating, that nest is very visible. And even with an adult sat on there, that is going to be very, very easy for any predators in the area, be it avian or ground predators, to actually see the bird, find the nest, and they can get predated. So the changes in land management are making a lot of these areas suboptimal for breeding waders, which is one of the reasons for the decline. Also, in some areas, the changes to woodland planting have a negative effect. Basically, woodlands harbour predators, so you will increase the numbers of foxes, crows, species like that predate on the birds. They like to be in conifer woodlands, so it increases predator numbers, and the predators can then spread out into adjoining areas to actually, take eggs and chicks, which again is driving the declines. And because of the fact that woodlands have a lot of predators, breeding waders don't actually like nesting near these woodlands, so you can push the waders away from them and make the land unsuitable for that. So one of the roles the National Park Authority plays is that we do a lot of consultation to look at areas to try and determine whether or not they are suitable. So we are targeting woodland planting in sort of gills where they're not going to have the same impact from a predation point of view, and also areas of the park that have lower numbers of waders, or areas where, for example, it's steeply sloping ground where it's just not suitable for the breeding waders to take place. But in some areas of the country, you may well have heard about the floor country up in Scotland. When these conifer plantations were put in, they had disastrous negative impacts on the breeding waders. Predation is a key problem. There are a lot of predators about. These predators like the carrion crow, these mesopredators, these generalist predators that will feed on eggs, chicks, are increasing and are having a detrimental effect in many areas. Increases in foxes as well. As I said in the earlier slide, they're not always straightforward. That in areas of suboptimal habitat, the nests, eggs and young can be a lot more easy for these predators to detect. But in the conjunction with poor habitat and an increase in these numbers can have the impact, and that is one of the reasons that the populations are in decline. So some form of lethal predator control is often employed in areas for waders to make sure they get the eggs. The eggs will hatch and the chicks will fledge because of the very high density of predators that we get in the UK. And then you get a lot of combined factors, so it may not be one that's driving it, but here you can see the round bales, the change from hay to silage, earlier cutting dates may have a negative impact on it. Climate change is going to be a key driver, so the drying out of these areas. So many of these areas, they used to be wet right through the summer, providing insects for the chicks, but now they're becoming a lot drier, and that is having a detrimental effect on some of the breeding habitat. And also things like stocking numbers as well. So it doesn't really show this very well, but that lamb is actually eating the eggs of a redshank nest that it came across. We don't think they're necessarily sort of finding these out, but in an area, if you get particularly high stocking rates in the field and lots of stock, then the likelihood of these coming across, eggs is a lot higher and may well be having a negative effect in accumulation with all the other factors that I've mentioned on this slide and earlier before. And again, changes in land use. So things like, just to be aware of, about things like rewilding. So where stock is taking off, you can see that there is the vegetation will naturally grow taller, and we are looking to get more areas of scrub and natural regeneration of woodland into the uplands. But these areas are not suitable. These type of habitats are not suitable for waders. So there may well be, an issue there if they occur in areas that have got high wader densities. I'm not for one moment saying that we're against, tree planting or rewilding or anything else like that, but it's just something to be aware of when you're looking at trying to deal with a whole range of different land management issues on a landscape scale. And I've included this really to give you an example of one of the tools that we use when we're looking at woodland planting. So this is the BTO Wader Zonal Map that's been produced by the BTO and the Forestry Commission. So very simplistically, this is all the squares are 1 kilometre squares, and they are ranked as to their importance for waders for all the species, and then combined to produce this map. So basically, the dark red areas here are the important areas for breeding waders, where the densities, both the numbers and the densities are highest, and the pale areas and the white areas are where there are no breeding waders. So along with this is a series of guidelines that we follow and woodland managers will follow to look at woodland planting. But the Forestry Commission and Natural England are basically saying there is a presumption against woodland planting in these areas that are the brightest red because of their importance for breeding waders. So a lot of the work that the authority do is trying to work out and work with landowners so we can plant woodlands where appropriate in areas without having a detrimental effect on the waders. So this is planting in things like gills, so you can not have predator perches for crows and avoiding some of the core areas. I've also included it just to sort of highlight some of the issues and just have a think about some of the wider landscape scale management issues. So you can see from this, the bright red squares, roughly 60, 70%, 75% of the national park has been identified as being really important for breeding waders, which is brilliant for the waders perspective, helps us bring in agri-environment scheme funding and other resources to tackle that. But there's a lot of pressure on these upland areas. So there was one report done by a national conservation body that identified that 40% of the national park could, as a minimum, be planted with trees. And a lot of those tree planting areas were in these areas here that are shown as bright red that are really important for waders. So there would be a potential conflict there. And things like I've seen targets for things like rewilding, where they would like to see, for all the right reasons, 30, 40% of the national park rewilded, which would have a whole range of positive conservation benefits. But somehow we need to work this in with priority species like the breeding waders that you can see here are well distributed over the national park. So there are a lot of challenges for those of us who are looking at managing for a whole different set of conservation priorities across a wider landscape. So what are we doing about some of these things? We're very pleased that we're working with the British Trust for Ornithology on quite a lot of these projects. One of is the Farming in Protected Landscapes, the FIPL project. One of the things we're doing, we're working with the BTO, is looking at trying to compare different survey methodologies to look at whether or not these could be rolled out on a landscape scale. So a lot of the time, in order to get some of the funding, you need to show that there's breeding waders there, which traditionally has meant somebody going out and physically surveying them, which is very time consuming to arrange and carry out. But there, some of the modern technology that's being applied are these audio moth recorders. which, as you can see, are these small square recording devices that are placed on a fence post or a dry stone wall that actually pick up the bird calls. These are then stored on a memory card, downloaded as WAV files, and are put into this bird sound identification program, and the calls come out in a tabular form that tell you what breeding waders are actually present, and other species as well on the land. So we've had the BTO have had an PhD student has been looking at this to look at how well they work. So it has gone through all thousands and thousands of recordings to actually work out which species are present and which are calling, and then cross-checking with them against these computer programs that tell you which species are present. So like I say, he has spent hours just listening to all these wader calls. And one of the things, they do work quite well, but unfortunately not all of them are correct. It appears from some of the work that's been done that they are very, very good at detecting curlew, perhaps because it's got quite a distinct call. But things like redshank are a bit more problematic, and it is not correctly recording those. So there has to be some work done to look at how potentially these recordings could be used to assess breeding wader populations. So they've found that some of the problems with these is that, unfortunately, we have some very good mimics. So it appears that song thrushes will mimic quite a lot of species, and in the upland areas where there might be a bit of scrub or a bit of tree, they are hearing waders and are mimicking wader calls, which are being misidentified by this program as breeding waders. So I hope that implies that we've got quite a good population of song thrushes across the Dales. But we found, or the BTO have found with their work, that the other big culprit is some of the sheep. Especially distant sheep calls can be misinterpreted by the computer program as a breeding wader call. So we do have to look at being careful about the analysis. But what the BTO are doing is looking to see if these can be used to determine population numbers and presence or absence. So they are doing on farms. We're working with them. So they've got an audio off out looking at taking recordings. They've got this farm wader calendar, which is designed for the farmers to try and not necessarily take detailed sort of survey information, but just a form to fill in, as you can see here, that as they're going about their day-to-day business, they're recording stock numbers, and they can make a note of our estimates of breeding waders. We at the National Park, we're working with volunteers. So this is a number of volunteers out on a training day where we're actually going out on those same farms. The farmers are doing the farm calendar, the audio moths are out, and we're using the standardised survey methodologies. We've trained volunteers to estimate the number of breeding pairs that are present. And some of the work that the BTO are doing is actually comparing these. I'm not going to go through a lot of the details. They're going to write all this up and it will be published in due course. But basically, this graph shows the comparisons on 6 farms. So the green is the estimate from the actual farm wader calendars that the farmers have done. The red line is the estimates from the audio moth calls based on the number of calls that are recorded today, and the blue is the estimates derived from the standard bird surveys carried out by our volunteers. So hopefully you can see from that because the lines are very similar, there is a strong correlation between these. So we're hopeful that some of these audio moths could be rolled out on a much bigger landscape scale to help target breeding wader conservation. One of the other things the BTO have been doing, have been tagging the curlews to look at habitat use in and around the nesting area. So that's done by carefully licensed individuals who've got many years of training to actually catch them. So they use a spring net, which you can see here on the left, and a recording device, and that is not a dead curlew, that is a stuffed curlew that they use as a decoy to bring the birds in along with the call. Once they come to the bird and the call, this clap net fires over. The people race across, and then, as you can see on the right, they fit this satellite-mounted tag harness on the back of the bird that will give out regular downloads of where the bird is, so we can look at the land use type. So once it's all done, like I say, these people are incredibly skilled at what they do. They've been doing it for a lot of years, fully licensed, doesn't affect the birds at all, as you can see from this one. They're actually released out, and then they will collect the data back, and they will, in the process, is still doing a lot of the analysis of looking at what land use the birds are using during the breeding season. So they were producing lots of maps like this, so they know where the birds are using. So basically that area in the middle with the two larger dots in is the core area that they're utilising during the chick rearing period. So they can then look at analysing, on the maps from aerial photography and other survey data, what the land use types are. So we can look at what are the best areas for breeding curlew, and this will help in the long term or the medium term to help target conservation work in the key areas for curlew. The other thing it's allowed us to do with these is it's allowed us to work out where they're going. So they managed to tag 17 curlew this year. Fantastic effort, a massive amount of time put in by BTO staff there. And as you can see, basically most of our birds move west to spend the winter. So there's birds down on the Morecambe Bay, on the Mersey estuary, one in North Wales, and as you can see, there are a number of birds that have gone over to Ireland to spend the winter, and only one bird that seems to have gone east, down to Lincolnshire. So it'll be intriguing over the years to see if these migratory trends are continued, and it will give us key information about where these birds are wintering as well, because the wintering areas are just as important as the breeding grounds. So hot off the press, I only got these from the BTO literally at the beginning of this week, so I've added them into the presentation. So we now know, we've heard birds in the Dales, we've seen them, and we now know from the satellite tag information that these are coming back. So this is a bird that wintered down on the Mersey estuary and some of the fields inland, is now back in the Yorkshire Dales, and will hopefully back on its breeding territory, in the coming weeks. And this is another bird, our bird that was in Lincolnshire, that's also come back more or less at the same time. I presume that the warmer weather at the start of this week, and as I said at the start of the presentation, the earlier, the lighter nights now is encouraging these birds to come back. So this satellite tag data will not only help us work out the habitat use around the nest sites, but also help with tracking movements like this. So really the key issues that we're trying to look at now in terms of how we conserve these species is the compensation to farmers through these agri-environment schemes. So one of the issues was that these used to be funded and delivered through the Common Agricultural Policy, but post-Brexit they now have to be written up as and delivered from internal government budgets and with internal guidance. So these have been a long time coming, and we're still waiting for some of the clarification on some of the key schemes and prescriptions that we use for managing for breeding waders. So there's a lot to learn about the new prescriptions, the payments, and a lot for the both advisory work and for the farmers to take in through these new schemes, which is Countryside Stewardship Plus and the Sustainable Farming Incentive. You may well have heard about nature recovery strategies. They are the new sort of conservation national strategies that are sort of replacing biodiversity action plans. So there will be these strategies for each county. So we are working with Cumbria, North Yorkshire and Lancashire to integrate nature recovery strategy for the national park into these county level schemes. But curlew will be, and the lapwing as well, are priority species for the Dales. So we will be looking to work these into these strategies that will hopefully deliver the conservation. Also, one of the key things with various different organisations are looking at is things like the cost effectiveness of nest fencing. So we know that curlew especially will nest in silage meadows, so the risk of getting cut by machinery before the eggs hatch. So potentially fencing those off can be a very good way of stopping that. We're working with the farmers; they'll just drive around the fences and avoid the nests. But there is a lot of work to be done to look at whether this is actually having a long-term effect in terms of just leaving small areas of uncut grass may mean that they're more vulnerable to predators. One of the things, it's very time consuming. There are a lot of dedicated volunteers out there who are going out and looking for nests and telling the farmers where they are so they can be fenced. But is there sufficient people to do that on the landscape scale right across the north of England? Like I said, there's a lot of issues and things like that. A lot of positives, but a lot of issues that need to be looked at before these can be rolled out. And unpalatable to some, but predator control, as I've said earlier, is one of the drivers of the decline. So there does need to be looking to funding and methods of predator control that can be done to protect the nesting birds. There's also the Curlew Solutions trial that Natural England, the BTO, and the Curlew Recovery Partnership are working towards. There's various projects looking at delaying grass cutting. So as well as, if they are nesting in silage or hay meadows, you can delay cutting the grass to a later date, try and encourage like this more traditional haymaking. That would prevent the problem because the grass is cut after the young, after the eggs have hatched and when the young are quite old and can move about. Again, this nest fencing from ground predators in the farming operations is one of the things that this Curlew Solutions trial funded by Natural England will be looking at, along with habitat restoration. So I talked earlier in my presentation showing you some of the things that can be done for the management work, making scrapes, creating wet areas, managing your rush. All those can be done to restore areas that are unsuitable, or if, where the habitat is no longer suitable, these can be restored for bringing back breeding waders. And we're fortunate that we have got good numbers still, so there's a lot of positive work that can be done on the restoration side. And it is also looking at these lethal predator control options. So hopefully that's given you a rough idea of the importance of areas like the Yorkshire Dales National Park for waders. Like I say, we're still very fortunate that we have good numbers of many of these species. Some of the monitoring work we're doing suggests that populations may well be stable. So hopefully we are tackling a number of issues, but also highlight that there is also a lot more to do. No one's complacent about these populations issues, and we are working with a whole range of different organisations, landowners, land managers, to try and make sure that, as in this slide, the species like the curlew will remain. Calling, that fantastic bubbling call, the display call, which will start happening in the next few weeks, will be there for a very long time. So, like I say, it's been quite a rush. There's quite a lot to go through in a short space of time, but hopefully that will have given you a feel for what we're doing in terms of the waders. I think really one of the real positives for curlew is that, virtually all the landowners and land managers, a lot of the shooting estates, everyone is on the same page with curlew. They really, want to see them remain in the Dales. Often from an organisation like ourselves doing advisory work, one of the biggest difficulties or first hurdles to get over is to actually try and encourage people to do the conservation work that you would like them to do. So there is often dialogue to try and persuade them to do it. But we're very fortunate that, like I say, many landowners are really proud they've got breeding waders, especially the curlew, and are already keen to work with us to help deliver positive conservation. So we're not being complacent. There are a lot of issues, but I think and hope that, through the work that we're doing and the work of a whole range of other organisations, hopefully we'll have waders present up in the Dales in the long term. And I'm going to finish with a shameless plug for the Cry of the Curlew exhibition that is now currently taking place in the Dales Countryside Museum in Hawes. This again highlights how curlews and waders affect lots of different people. So we've got photographers, artists, poets that are all being infused and inspired by curlew. And this is a collection of artwork and photographs talking about the curlew, some of the issues, and how different people are influenced by them, including, you might be able to see towards the right hand side of it, Kirby Mallam School. You know, the school kids have done some absolutely brilliant drawings of curlews, so we have hope for the next generation of curlew enthusiasts and wading conservationists waiting in the wings there to lead this work in future. So thank you for listening, and I just want to thank, like I say, we wouldn't be able to do this work without a whole range of different landowners, land managers and farmers, and in particular the BTO we're working with very closely and have put many hours of work in over the field season in the year, particularly Paul Noyes and Samantha Fangs.